My name is Ava Lynn, 29 years old. He didn't end it like a car crash. He tried to end it like a yoga breath. Slow, centered, faux wise. Ethan set his phone face down on our coffee table like a prop. Screen off, performance on, and folded his hands as if he were mediating a small dispute between two reasonable adults instead of lighting a match and tossing it into the life we shared. "I'm in a weird place right now," he began, voice gentle in that curated way people use when they want to sound evolved, while they do something cowardly. "I need a break, just some time to figure out what I really want." He had rehearsed. I could hear the polish. He sounded like his favorite podcasts had been stitched together into a single self-help soliloquy. There were phrases about growth, space, clarity. There were pauses engineered for me to nod. I didn't. I looked at his hands instead, the way his thumbs pressed into each other, whitening the knuckles. He was nervous, which meant he cared how this looked, not how it felt. For months, I'd sensed a rot I couldn't locate, only feel. Late-night texts he angled away from my line of sight. Weekend plans with the guys that came with new cologne and a pressed shirt. That offhand way he said his ex's name, Alexis, like the syllables were neutral, harmless, a box of winter clothes you keep just in case. "I need a break," he said again, softer, to find myself. "Tell me what a break looks like," I asked, keeping my voice flat. I didn't trust it to carry emotion without shattering. "It just means we're not together for a little while," he said with bright, borrowed maturity. "We can see other people if we want, but we're not over. We're just on pause." There it was, the contractual language of a hall pass. Something inside me, something tired, old, and finally done, clicked into place. I'd spent a year translating his silences into kindness, his distance into stress, his nostalgia for a woman who had already left him once into harmless memory. But a pause is not a fix. A pause is a runway. "Okay," I said, and watched relief wash over his face so completely it was almost insulting. There was a tiny smile, the one he got when he'd smuggled a win past me. "Thank you for being so understanding," he said. Lighter now, buoyant. "I knew you'd be mature about this." "Of course," I said. Then I stood, feeling the ground steady under my feet. "Where will you be staying during your journey of self-discovery?" He blinked. "What?" "A break means we're not together," I said, "which means we don't live together. My name is on the lease. Yours isn't. The locks change tomorrow at 5. You can pack tonight." His mouth parted in genuine confusion, then reconfigured into the first honest emotion I'd seen all evening. Disbelief. He had expected a holding pattern, not a landing. "You're not serious," he said, laugh sharp and mirthless. "You're being emotional because I'm being honest." I crossed to the hall closet and slid out the leftover moving boxes from my last place. I set them down between us like a quiet verdict. He moved quickly through the stages. Scoff. Anger. "You can't kick me out. I live here." Pleading. "Okay, fine. I don't need a break. Can we just forget I said anything?" He even tried tenderness. That murmured, "You're my best friend, Ava," like I should feel honored to be his understudy while he auditioned someone else. I didn't engage. I labeled boxes with a marker. Clothes, shoes, tech. It was both petty and practical to give his things neat categories while he tried to make our life messy. He slept on the couch after a long, performative sigh. I closed our bedroom door and felt the thunder of my own pulse slow to normal. My heart, loud and stunned minutes ago, began to sound like it belonged to me again. At dawn, I left for work early. At the door, I said, "End of day for your things. Locksmith at 5. My tone had the calmness of an email with a firm deadline. By the time I arrived at my desk, my phone was already a hive. Not from him, he'd blocked me on everything, but from the watch party he'd assembled elsewhere. The public performance began on schedule, a grayscale selfie, eyes wet, captioned with an epigram about choosing yourself. The comments came like confetti from his chorus. "So brave, king, healing era. Proud of you for leaving toxicity." In a single morning, I had wandered into the role of villain in a show I hadn't auditioned for. I didn't defend myself. I didn't launch a counter-narrative. I let the feed do what feeds do. Scroll onward. At lunch, a text slipped through from a number I hadn't saved because I didn't need to. I knew it by the cadence alone. "Cade, he's at Alexis's place." Cade had always been the anomaly in Ethan's circle. Quiet, observant, and disconcertingly decent. He and I had bonded over small, unfashionable preferences, Black coffee, old movies, the relief of plans that start on time. He was loyal to Ethan in the old-fashioned way, the pre-social media way, which made this text not gossip, but a stitch laid down where a seam had split. I looked at the words for a long time without responding. It wasn't new information, it was confirmation. A pause, I thought, is a bridge you build when you've already chosen the shore. I spent the afternoon moving through my tasks with mechanical ease, the way you do after a jolt, body on autopilot, while the mind rearranges furniture in a room it didn't know it was renting. When the locksmith arrived at 5, I met him with a nod that felt ceremonial. Ethan had already gone. The living room was tidier than I expected, which meant he had packed quickly, efficiently, like a traveler who always knew he'd never fully unpack. On the sofa, he'd left a note in his round, earnest handwriting. I hope we can be friends. I folded it once and slid it into the trash under a coffee filter and the day's junk mail. That night, the apartment felt different. Not emptier, quieter. The absence wasn't a loss. It was air, returning to a sealed room. I opened windows. The city drifted in. Scooters, distant laughter, the soft percussion of rain beginning somewhere I couldn't see. I made pasta and ate it at the counter without ceremony, fork tapping the side of the bowl in a rhythm that was no one's but mine. On impulse, I pulled every last one of his forgotten trinkets into a box. Chargers, cufflinks, the baseball he always tossed when he was thinking, and rented a small storage unit in his name. I mailed the key and the bill to the address I knew by heart from old Amazon packages. It felt both petty and fair to make the logistics symmetrical. For a week, he played his role online with vigor. Stories from a gym bathroom mirror, slideshows of quotes about boundaries from accounts that had never met a boundary they didn't misinterpret, a soft focus latte captioned healing. His followers applauded a transformation performed entirely in captions. Privately, though, the edges frayed. Snippets found me, and through friends of friends, he was crashing with someone. He was figuring it out. He was taking time. The details were strategically foggy until Cade texted again. He brought flowers to Alexis's. He's calling it fate. I almost smiled. Fate often looks like a contact you never deleted. I didn't respond to Cade's first 2 messages. It felt unfair to make him the courier of Ethan's choices. On the third, I typed, "You don't owe me updates." He sent back a single dot, then, "I know, but I thought you should have facts, not rumors." I stared at that for a long minute. Facts, not rumors. A small, necessary mercy. The second Sunday after he moved out, I woke before the sun and walked until the city unlocked itself. By the time cafes were setting out chairs, my mind felt like a cleared inbox. Not empty, but manageable. The world had not ended. It had rearranged. The narrative he posted and the one I lived were now 2 different things, and that was somehow a kind of freedom. A notification blinked on my phone, a calendar alert I'd set months ago for a deadline I dreaded. The big project at work had been limping along for weeks, trapped under delays and a missing lead. I'd avoided volunteering because life was already heavy. Now the weight had shifted and my hands were free. At 9:12 a.m., my boss called with a question that sounded like a door opening. "How quickly could you be ready to take over the Paris site if I asked?" I didn't answer right away. I watched a ray of light find the chipped lip of my coffee cup. Across the street, a child laughed, high and surprised, as if joy had jumped out from behind a door. I thought about runways and bridges and pauses that weren't fixes so much as preludes. "Send me the brief," I said. "I'll read it today." I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I knew whether this was a detour or a new map. On my walk home, the rain started in earnest, stitching tiny silver lines across the street. I didn't hurry. The locksmith had changed the locks. The apartment would be there when I arrived. Quiet, mine, waiting. Inside, my phone buzzed again. Another grayscale selfie, another caption about courage. Under it, a comment from Alexis with a white heart. I turned the phone face down. Somewhere, I thought, someone is always building a tower of their own story. Let him. I had a new blueprint to read. The flight was booked before the reality could argue back. 3 months in Paris. A failing development site my firm needed rescued. It sounded less like work and more like permission. To start over in a place where no one knew the version of me that had tolerated half-truths and practiced patience as a love language. The company apartment was larger than I expected. high ceilings, wide windows that drank light, 2 bedrooms that echoed with possibility. I walked through it the first evening with my suitcase wheels whispering across the floor, imagining what silence would sound like in this new language. When I told Cade, his first reaction wasn't surprise, it was hesitation. "Paris," he said, "that's incredible, for you." Then, after a pause, "You'll need someone to translate all the menus." It started as a joke, but lingered. Cade had studied art history before detouring into corporate logistics. Paris was his ghost city. He talked about it in quiet, wistful fragments whenever conversation drifted toward dreams. "I'll have a second bedroom," I said. "Empty. If you ever wanted to see the Louvre without Google Street View, there's space." He laughed softly, the sound caught between disbelief and temptation. "That's an absurd offer." "Absurd is available," I said. 2 days later, his text arrived. I bought a ticket. The first weeks were chaos. The Paris project was every rumor made flesh. Blueprints misaligned, vendors feuding, deadlines bleeding into each other. But chaos had rules. You just had to listen long enough to hear them. Work became my metronome. Days structured themselves around site visits and late-night calls home to the team. Kate arrived on a rain-damp Tuesday, jet-lagged and blinking like someone who'd stepped into a painting. He carried one suitcase and a sense of politeness so heavy I almost laughed. "Your pictures didn't lie," he said, turning slowly in the doorway. "It's beautiful." "You're seeing it on 3 hours of sleep," I reminded him. "Everything's beautiful on 3 hours of sleep." We slipped easily into rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of burnt espresso and the hum of street vendors below. I'd head to the site. He'd wander the city with a sketchbook, returning each night with stories folded into ticket stubs. Dinner was often baguette, cheese, and conversation that wandered wider than the Seine. He listened differently than Ethan ever had, less like he was waiting for his turn, more like he was building something out of my words. Slowly, I felt the scaffolding inside me begin to shift. One evening, after a long day of negotiations and near mutiny at the site, I came home to find Cade sitting on the balcony, sketching the rooftops. The city had turned gold in the dying light. "How was the battlefield?" he asked without looking up. "Held the line," I said, setting down my bag. "How was the museum?" He handed me his sketch pad. It wasn't the rooftops. It was me, head bent over blueprints, hair escaping its tie. I laughed, startled. "That's unnervingly accurate." "You have a face that thinks," he said simply. "People don't realize how rare that is." Something in my chest tightened, the quiet recognition of being seen, not summarized. I looked away first. "Dinner?" "Dinner," he echoed, smiling. We walked everywhere. The narrow alleys of Montmartre, the open sprawl of the Tuileries. Paris was a city built for pairings. Café tables set in twos, doorways just wide enough for shoulders to brush. Under its weight, old habits cracked. We talked about everything we hadn't said back home, Ethan's slow erosion into self-absorption, the way Alexis had orchestrated nostalgia like an art form. Kate admitted he'd always known the truth, but never had the courage to name it. "She made him feel like the version of himself he wanted to believe in," he said one night. "You made him feel accountable. That's why he left." "And you?" I asked quietly. He thought about it. "I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not cleaning up someone else's mess." There was no grand confession, no cinematic kiss beneath the Eiffel Tower, just small moments gathering momentum, shared jokes, overlapping grocery lists, the ease of proximity turning into gravity. By the second month, the project stabilized. For the first time in years, I woke without a weight pressing on my chest. One evening, I opened my phone and scrolled, half absent. Ethan's social media was still a curated museum of self-pity, motivational quotes, gym mirrors, a stray picture of Alexis captioned, "Some connections are timeless." The irony was almost elegant. I showed Cade, who shook his head. "Timeless is code for unemployed." "Petty," I said, laughing. "True," he countered. We were sitting on the Pont des Arts, the lock bridge, watching tourists carve their initials into brass. Cade reached over, fingers brushing mine, tentative as a question. I didn't pull away. The sun slipped lower, catching the river in molten light. Someone nearby played a violin, and the air felt like a held breath. It wasn't a declaration, it was recognition. The quiet, startled understanding that survival had turned into connection. The following week, the project wrapped ahead of schedule. My boss called it a miracle in hard hat form. For me, it felt like closure, both professional and personal. That night, I posted a single photo. Cade and I, caught mid-laugh as we crossed the bridge. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to cross an ocean to see what was right in front of you." Then, deliberately, I unblocked Ethan. 4 minutes later, the phone lit up. What? Then, who is that? Where are you? Is that Cade, my best friend? The messages tumbled in, frantic, disbelieving, hungry for control. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I set the phone down, closed the balcony door, and turned off the light. Outside, Paris kept glowing, indifferent and infinite. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll tell my boss I'm staying one more week. Because for the first time, I wasn't running from anything. I was exactly where I chose to be. By morning, the storm had gathered across every corner of the internet Ethan could still reach. He was doing what he did best, rewriting history with himself as the misunderstood lead. The first post appeared before sunrise, a dimly lit selfie in a cafe, captioned, "Some betrayals cut deepest when they come from those you trusted most." The comments filled instantly. "Stay strong. Healing isn't linear. Karma will handle them." Then came the direct messages to mutual friends. He called it a lapse in loyalty. He called me impulsive. He called Cade a user. But beneath the noise, I could hear what it really was. Panic disguised as prose. Cade read them, sighed, and deleted each one without reply. "He's flailing," he said simply. "He's realizing the break he wanted is permanent." The escalation arrived 48 hours later. My company's HR inbox received a long, fevered email from Ethan. It painted me as an unstable manipulator who had seduced a coworker during a corporate assignment. He claimed emotional coercion, professional misconduct, and whatever other accusations he could pull from the vocabulary of grievance. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I had already told my boss everything weeks ago. Not the drama, just the facts. I had ended a relationship before leaving. The man involved had struggled to accept it. The work came first, and the results would speak louder than any rumor. They had. The Paris project wasn't just finished. It was ahead of schedule and under budget. The regional director had called me personally to congratulate me. So when Ethan's email arrived, my boss simply forwarded it to legal, who replied with a short, precise cease and desist that could have frozen the sun. After that, the silence was total. A month passed. Cade and I returned home to find our city smaller somehow, like the world had shrunk around what we'd outgrown. Ethan's presence lingered only in stories that no longer reached us directly. Someone's cousin had seen him back with Alexis, then not with her, then back again. The cycle was predictable as weather. One night, as we unpacked boxes in my new apartment, our apartment now, Cade found the note Ethan had left on the couch months earlier. "I hope we can be friends." He held it up between two fingers. "You kept this?" "I forgot it was there." He smiled faintly. "You don't forget things. You just decide when they stop mattering." He was right. I tore it in half and dropped it into the bin with the packing paper. It made no sound. Spring arrived early that year. We spent weekends repainting walls and arguing softly about furniture choices. He liked clean lines. I liked stories. Secondhand pieces with dents and scratches that made rooms feel honest. Somewhere between those preferences, a home began to take shape. On quiet mornings, I'd catch him watching me while I worked at the kitchen table, his sketchbook forgotten on his lap. "What?" I'd ask, smiling. "Just taking proof," he'd say, "that people can rebuild and still look like themselves." Sometimes, when I thought about the sequence of it all, the break, the silence, the trip, the photo, it felt like a map drawn backward. Every wrong turn had pointed exactly where it needed to. A year later, we were standing in a small garden behind a rented villa, exchanging vows written on the backs of receipts. No audience, no hashtags, just two people who had learned the difference between noise and truth. Cade's family came. My parents did too. We ate simple food, laughed too much, and when dusk fell, fireflies lit the grass like tiny forgivenesses. I didn't know where Ethan was then, or what version of the story he was telling. Maybe he was still online, narrating heartbreak into poetry. Maybe he'd finally gone quiet. It didn't matter. Sometimes I think about that night on the couch, the one where he said pause and I said okay. I used to think that was the end of something. Now I know it was a beginning. Because when someone asks for space, you can give it to them. But if you're lucky, you'll realize that the space was always meant for you. And when you finally step into it, the air feels different. Not empty, but free.